Good evening, friends. It's always such a pleasure for me to be in Bombay. I grew up in this city and lived here for 27 years before I went abroad to study, for studies, and then never came back here to live. But it's always a pleasure for me to be here and to speak here. So I'm delighted to be here this evening. Before I start, I would like to express my deep thanks to the Asia Society, to Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore, to CSMVS, and Dr. Firuza Godrej for all their support. My special thanks are to Annapurna, who agreed to discuss at the end of my talk a few issues which are a part of the theme that Asia Society has given to us. My thanks this evening and discussion that follows pertains, my talk this evening and the discussion that follows pertains to the work of Jangarh Singh Shyam, because many of you may not know, and I have only half an hour, so I'm going to really go a little fast, a little run. So, but those who have no background, I just utter a few sentences about him. Jangarh Singh Shyam, an exceptionally fine artist who belonged to the Pardhan or Pardhan Gond tribal community of Pathangarh in Mandla district of Madhya Pradesh. At the age of 18 or 19, Jangarh moved to Bhopal and got affiliated with Bharat Bhavan, and in the following 20 years before he died, he produced a prolific body of work which brought him national and international reputation as an artist. His case was very different, like in Maharashtra, Jivya Soma Mashe, or you heard about Madhubani painting. They all came from a certain visual tradition. But Jangarh's case is very different. He came from a particular tribal cultural tradition, but he didn't come from a particular visual tradition. So he grew up in a modern art institution like Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal from a very young age that he came there, and he encountered things, and many interventions went into his work. So we are talking about how much and how, and he has shifted into the modern space. That's going to be an important sort of running thread of my talk. My talk is meant to be critical viewing, because so many people, Jangarh, and because of his suicide and things like that, the whole attention has gone elsewhere rather than about his own work. Very little is really published critically about his own work. So I have attempted in my book, which is being released here today, I've written that book from that viewpoint. My talk is meant to be a critical viewing of the complex trajectory of Jangarh's life and work, and a discussion on issues such as vernacularity, contemporaneity, and modernity, which, with particular reference to Jangarh's work, but also beyond Jangarh's work, that how these issues arise with reference to folk and tribal artists. Now, you have read this already. Before any sound critical framework could be evolved around the phenomenal artist Jangarh Singh Shyam, callous market forces came to dominate his art, and Jangarh himself became first casually. Now this I'm saying callous, I know I'm aware that this usually said, oh, market forces. I'm not talking about market forces bad. But what happened was that he committed suicide while working on paintings in Japan, and his stay was extended so much so that he felt trapped. He wanted to come out, and last two letters of his, which I have published in my book, show that how market worked upon him, and that he had to, he couldn't come out of the trap. And I particularly felt sorry because he was a great friend of mine, and I had commissioned him to do murals at Charles Correa Design Bharat Vidhan Bhavan in Bhopal, and we were very close friends. And when I read his second letter from Japan, where he really talked about being trapped over there and he can't come out, and he wrote continuously, can I be brought back to India? Very, very sad letter. And last paragraph he wrote to his wife that asked Jyotindra Jain if he can get me out of this place. And when I read that, I really felt that I owed this book to him, which I was anyway thinking of writing. But this was one of the reasons. But my whole critical analysis of Jangarh's work is art historical. So, last three lines here in Jangarh, you can already feel the kind of sadness he was feeling. I feel there is some foul play with regard to me. I don't know whether I will be able to see you people again, meaning his wife and children, and there is such a feeling. I'm writing this in fear. And then in the letters he wrote that they open my letters and read, because they gave him very large amount of work to finish, and his work had big market, so that played a big role. Now, some of you might know that the renowned artist J. Swaminathan was the director of Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal, and he had personal interest, and if you know his art, you can see that there are elements in his work which sort of are inspired by some of the folk and tribal, particularly tribal painting. So it was Swaminathan's, on his prompting, that Jangarh came. They were building a museum in Bharat Bhavan, and they wanted to have they wanted to have contemporary artists as well as folk and tribal artists, contemporary modern artists and folk and tribal artists. And therefore, teams were sent out to see all over in Madhya Pradesh whether there were important artists who were tucked away somewhere and all. So they, on his prompting, Jangarh was discovered in inverted commas. Jangarh's muse was molded at Bharat Bhavan, a modernist art institution where he arrived as a teenager on artist J. Swaminathan's prompting. Here, while responding to new mediations, bright pigments, ink pens, white paper, and printmaking in conjunction with the exposure to the art world, he brilliantly transformed the world of things and legends into world of images. Now, the thing is that what was this mediation? He used to work, interestingly, he didn't come from any major tradition of painting, like Madhubani. So the artists from Madhubani have sort of crossed over into another area, modern space. Or Varli even, Jivya Samamashi, for example, it was women's art. And so this, in Jangarh's case, there wasn't any important tradition over there. So he grew up in a modern art institution, and that the mediations that happened to him, that he was open to them, and how his work got mediated with things modern or contemporary, and how the whole body of work grew, is a very, very phenomenal thing. So now, two incidents of his life that I must mention here, because we talk about tribalism, tribal, urban, civilization, many other things. When I was curating an exhibition called Other Masters, in which Jangarh was one of the 5 artists, and that exhibition sort of really launched him nationally and to some extent internationally, and the exhibition became very known, and that's the exhibition which was talking about modernity and contemporaneity of tribal artists. So when I was one afternoon at Crafts Museum, I was sitting with Jangarh, and I asked him, tell me what's the meaning of your name, Jangarh? And he told me a very revealing story. He said that on the day when I was born, the census authorities of India officials had come to our village to count our population, his tribe's population. And that time, he said, on that day, when the census people were present, in Hindi, they are known as Jangarna Adhikari. So, the officers who, Jangarna Adhikari. So they said that when I was born, they said, oh, the day we have come here, a child is born, and therefore he should be named Jangarn. But then he said that but my people, not being well-versed in Sanskritic formulation like Jangarn, which is also the opening words of our national anthem. So he said they didn't know. So he said it was vernacularized as Jangarh. And therefore, I think in a way, amazing that this whole vernacularization of Jangarh continued right from the day he was born, unawarely that he was that from Sanskrit to vernacular. Another thing about these visuals that you see is that Jangarh, when I was doing this exhibition, other masters and bringing out a book, I wanted a photograph of his for my book, for the catalog of the exhibition. So at Crafts Museum in Delhi. So I called for him, and the photographer was waiting outside. So I said, Jangarh photographer is waiting, and photographer is waiting outside. Get yourself photographed. So he said, "Saab kapde khol do," meaning, shall I shed my clothes? So I said, why are you asking such a question? So he said there was a gallery in Delhi, and they were doing an exhibition of his work, and they said that if you're wearing jeans and modern clothes, then the authenticity of work won't be considered, and your painting may not sell as good. And therefore, so he had to be. So that picture, that photograph on the right side is a photograph from a gallery's catalog. So besides his art, which has often been uncritically treated under the category of subaltern or vernacular, he himself was continuously reminded of his subalternity, where his authenticity was seen residing, in his subalternity. So because a tribal artist's authenticity exists just prior to the present, so he has to be somewhere far so the authenticity lies somewhere else, deep somewhere. So say our authenticity must lie somewhere in the Vedas, or we are like the country. So we search for this authenticity far somewhere far away, and that is why I think this photograph gives me those signals. Then, before we go to Jangarh, I just want to talk about general issues of the tradition is not something frozen in the past, but passes through evolving context and conflict and change. That, whenever, things happen, it's not that tribals or other communities are mute observers. They do see and bring things in their life, and that is how, in a way, modernity enters in their work. So like here, this is a detail from a painting of Jivya Soma Mashe, and he told me when he did his painting, he said that in his village, for perhaps from 6, 7, 8 generations or more, there is a talk about how a railway line came, because this is like just north of Bombay. And he said when a railway line came, it cut his village really into two. So half the rivers were on the other side, half the river was on this side, half the fields and families were one side, another. So this remained in the memory and imagination of in the memory of the people. And then when he had a very large canvas available to him, his thoughts went back. So the space available, the mediation of that space makes you makes you or wants you to tell your story. So it inspires you to tell your story. And this is how this kind of new mediations have brought about many things in contemporary context from folk and tribal communities. Here, sorry. Yeah. Here, for example, is a detail from a Santal creation song, a creation scroll. And Mahadev, when he visits the first couple after creation, he's escorted by policemen, for example. Now, because they've seen ministers and, walking. So suddenly you find and also in Santals particularly, and in eastern India, because there are these issues of land grabbing and absentee landlordism and many of those things. Many of these things have begun to appear in Santal scrolls. So certain political, social, political, and personal predicaments of tribal artists also, when it starts to reflect in the work, I think they are entering the contemporary space. This is also, for example, a detail from Madhubani artist Gangadevi's painting when she got cancer, and she did 4 paintings out of the doctor talking to her and thing. And when she was lying down, she always, her eyes were upwards, and that's why ceiling fan, temperature charts, and things began to appear when she, and to do autobiographical works itself is something stepping up, because tribals never did autobiographical work. So this is already entering the modern space. I will hurry up a bit because I won't finish in half an hour. Otherwise, now Jangarh, we are talking about retrieving the world left behind, a place from where he spoke. Because when he was very young, he came to Bhopal, and the whole world of forest life, creatures, gods, shamanism, lots of things in which he grew up was all left behind. So he was full of memories of those things, and therefore his entire body of work is a sort of recreation through images. What was left behind became memory images afterward in his work, and that is the place from where he speaks, by creating a world through his and created a work, and that's the world that from where he speaks. So there's a space from where he speaks through his work. This is an interesting photograph. You can see Jangarh on right side. Now this is a dome that Jangarh, he painted several domes. This is the building of Bharat Bhavan, built by Charles Correa. And you can see at right side Jangarh, when he came to Bhopal, just prior to that, Mark Tully, the BBC journalist, he had written a chapter in his book, No Full Stops in India. And there he talks about, he asked Jangarh, before you went to Bhopal, what did you do? So he said, I used to carry mud on my head, and I was a laborer as a road worker. So he used to build road around his village, and he was employed from time to time. So you can see him here. He's the first year around when he came to Bhopal, and and I like this photograph immensely because that image of his as a laborer sort of still remains, and doing this kind of painting, he still sort of sits there as he came, the kind of background he came from. On the right, on the upper side, upper here, for example, he worked in printmaking department in Bharat Bhavan, and therefore question of impression in print, printmaking. And there, in village homes, you always find outside the house, on both sides of the door, people put palm impressions and things. So here he used that in his large mural context that he brings, but here he uses as a kind of reconstituted language of painting. Then, as I said, that very rarely artists do something autobiographical or personal. Now, this is a very interesting painting, again, in the collection of Mark Tully, and self-portrait or allegory of Krishna. This painting has a very special meaning for me also, because Jangarh told me a story that he said that when he was about 13, 14 years old, he was an excellent and very accomplished flute player, Jangarh. So in his village days, he used to take a herd of his cows and go to the next village for grazing. And he said that he used to sit a whole day under a tree and play flute. And there was a girl who was living just on a nearby on a hillock, and she would come with her milk pot for selling. And whenever he would play his flute, the girl would come down and pass by. And finally, at the age of 14, Jangarh eloped. He sort of went away, eloped with and then big problem arose because the girl was married at the age of 2, and therefore the two groups had a big thing. What I'm talking about is that at that Jangarh, there is, of course, all of you know that there is this thing of self-portrait or allegory of Krishna. It's such a parallel over there. And many years later, Jangarh did this painting, and that's the only painting which is because it's obviously iconographically and otherwise it is not Krishna. And Jangarh was very fond of snakes. Many of his paintings have snakes and things. So this is a painting that he did based on his life. Then the Pardhans of upper Narmada Valley, to which Jangarh belonged, and half the Pathangarh village was inhabited by Gonds and half by Pardhans. So Pardhans were the bards of the Gonds. So you might have heard about Gondwana and Gond kingdoms, medieval Gond kingdoms and things. So these Pardhan community were the singers, and all. Jangarh also was an accomplished singer, and they used to sing the glory of the Gond Rajas and things. So there was a lot of, through these, there was a lot of connection with Hindu legends and things. And there were also like Hindu influences came from folk singers like Pandavani singers who came past villages and sang. So a lot of Hindu things got sort of introduced to tribal communities over decades now, over centuries now. And then they have undergone transformation, and those then occur in general. So for example, the story of Sesha Naga, which is in Hinduism, it's a very important character. That so it is believed that when the serpent snake, which holds the earth on its head, when it uncoils, then the time moves forward, and when he coils back, the universe ceases to exist. And this gets somehow imbibed into Pathangarh's creation myth, both Gond and Pardhans. So in Hindu myth and depictions, Sesha is shown holding the earth on the head, but here for Jangarh, the earth meant the forest around him, and therefore he has very beautifully conceptualized the earth, because there's the earth around him. So he's conceptualized the earth in this manner, or also here that this is the earth, and then the forest, which was, because they were forest dwellers, so he has then this is my favorite painting. What is happening here is that the textures and patterns, textures and patterning is not merely decorative here. The translucent skin of the lizards, you might have seen some lizards, it's always a little translucent, and you can see inside the plasma, the movement, the heaving, and sort of movement of breathing, etc., is seen. So to show that, so this kind of heaving and pulsating movement underneath the skin, he has used these textures. So you can see that these textures are not just decorative, but he has used them very all his work, he was a master of creating patterns and textures, but nowhere you feel that it's just decorative. So, this use of textures and patterns becomes very apparent over here. Then there is, he did a painting called Fulvari Devi, Fulvari Devi. That was his communities or family goddess. And it is personification of the river Narmada, because Patangarh, his village, is on the bank of the river Narmada. And also Jangarh's family deity. Now he has heard a story. What Jangarh did was that his deities, because the gods and his deities were never done in anthropomorphic form. They were just done in symbolic and abstract form. He gave sort of deities became real by the truth of his imagination, Jangarh's imagination. So he created, and that's how there was a kind of, even though they were images of deities, these were like shifting to a kind of secular conceptualization of deities, because these were not meant for worship. And therefore, so the story over here is quite interesting, that that the goddess Narmada was engaged to a prince, and he was to come to marry her. And Narmada got dressed up like a bride, and the bridegroom didn't arrive. So she asked her sister Jihala to go and see if the bridegroom was coming. So Jihala said, "But I have no clothes to wear." So Narmada, who was dressed up as bride, she gave her clothes to the sister, and she went. When the prince came, he saw her, and he thought, that is the bride. So he married and went away northwards, and Narmada continued to flow southwards. But then Narmada got so angry that she started to splash water all side, and her body was smeared with turmeric, as usually a bride's body is covered with turmeric paste. So when she did that, the turmeric and the water fell on the sides, and that became what they call Ram Raj, which is a yellow clay which all the Pardhans use for smearing the floor of their house, or for using for clay relief work, etc. So he has conceptualized a yellow body of the goddess and water below where she is seated. So this kind of transformations he brought about in his work. Then the entire central Indian tribal belt, starting from Gujarat, going right up to Bihar and Orissa, they have a particular motive of the creation myth, in which they always say that the earth had 7 compartments or continents or 7 layers or something like that. So this part of the depiction of the earth, in Jangarh's case, he has done as if, an aerial landscape. So again, his exposure to cities and things that comes in interpreting his creation myth. And then he also shows the earth here, for example. So these are different fields, as you see from the airplane, and these are furrows in which grains are sown. So these are the fields in which, so he has conceptualized the earth as in his creation myth, and the dots here are the seeds that are sown in the field. As I mentioned to you earlier, Jangarh was a very accomplished printmaker. When he came to Bharat Bhavan, he was given a job in printmaking department, and that is where he learned about textures and things, and really modern language of working with things. And but there also, he used to do screen printing of other artists in Bharat Bhavan, but also he started to do his own work, and he began to do lot of experiments going beyond what generally art school artists would do. So, for example, he would splash ink, or he would do scratching on the screen and then take. So look at the kind of fantastic textures and things and expressions and movement and everything that he is able to bring he often did multiple impressions from the same silk screen and thing. So he was highly experimental, and a lot of his work, actually, because he worked for many years in printing department over there, and he from that, I think a lot of his, particularly his black and white drawing, emerged as this kind of awareness of textures and things. Then there was a big turn in Jangarh's life after 1990, and his work particularly, that he went abroad because he was invited to several exhibitions, and particularly he was an important artist in the very famous French exhibition called Magicians of the Earth, Magiciens de la Terre, where first time he was internationally shown. And later on, one of the trips abroad, somebody introduced to him rote ring pen. Artists would know rote ring pen, the black drawing pen. And after that, his work changed, and he did about 200 drawings, which are, as you can see here already, there's extraordinary refinement and conceptualization that came. Now, what he was doing was that he would hold the pen and, like this, he would do strokes. And as you can see here, for example, the whole aura of light and luminosity and radiance that comes. Now, this is not the kind of work he would have ever done as a village artist. He came to the city and these elements began. So there was a big turn in his monochromatic drawing after his exposure to that, to the pen. And these are both paintings of birds. Both are birds in union painting of this, and I think you can see that how creatively he has used the new intervention or new mediation that came to him. And similarly, for example, here that scorpions slumber in among Pardhans, and I think also among Gonds nearby. Slumber becomes the measure of the cosmic time. So they always talk about scorpion sleeping over eons, and they count this cosmic time in terms of scorpions. So you can see that it's not a kind of realistic depiction, but you do get that feeling that the scorpion is lying somewhere for centuries, just sleeping. And as I said, it becomes a measure of cosmic time in Pardhan mythology. And on the right side, again, the force with which the bird is swooping over the snake, and stealthy resistance of the snake and vigorous plunge of the bird just in kind of line, and then this radiance that is coming, because he was so enchanted by the pen that he got from abroad, and he produced very wonderful, beautiful drawings after that. Also, some of the things, as I said, that he reconstructed his village world, which he brought along in his mind, but they didn't have a particular visual tradition as such. So in Bharat Bhavan, lot of those memories came back in terms of series of images. So Pardhans have a custom in the field to when a bullock dies, they put half the body inside the ground and half outside, and that is they call Nazar Bandhani Mukhota, meaning mask for fixing the evil eye. And the one on the right side for Jangarh was, you see here, this is a shivling over here, and Jangarh, and bull is Shiva's bull. So when a bull dies, they put it in the field, and then, so these are kind of all these memory images that are brought in his work. I'm hurrying up because I think already I must have taken more than. Then Jangarh was himself, he described himself as a devotee of Shiva. And actually, most tribal communities in India, they have imbibed some level of Shaivism in their mythology. And so there are a lot of Shaivite elements in folk and tribal communities. So here, for example, he has created he created so many new iconographies. So this one is Ganesh Shiva, he calls it, somewhere he has written here, Ganesh Shiva. So he put Shivling here and the trident of Shiva. Then here Shiva's head is becoming, is in the form of Shivling itself and trident, and then these three birds in the form of a trident again. So these are again, as I said, he came with those things in his mind, and then he began, when he got possibility of color and paper and things, he began to. Then there was a time when Jangarh turned to narrative. It's very interesting that almost all tribal communities, when they got paper or large spaces, they turned to narrative. They didn't have narrative tradition. Madhubani, for example, there was no narrative tradition at all in Madhubani. This was a marriage painting. Warli, for example, they didn't have any narrative tradition. They had symbolic representation on the wall or in the room where marriage was marriage was solemnized. Also, Jangarh, even little bit clay relief work tradition that they have had was not actually narrative. So, seeing large spaces, domes and building walls and large sheets of paper and thing, somehow the paper sort of demanded or invited people to tell their stories, artists to tell their stories. And here it's a very interesting Jangarh has done painting, a very interesting painting that Jangarh has done. As I said, that the certain Hindu mythology, for centuries, it's not new, it's not post-present rule. For centuries, folk singers were passing through villages, Pandwani singer, some of you might have heard the name of Tijan Bai, the famous Pandwani singer. So they used to bring, and there was for centuries already a movement called Bhagatization, meaning converting people to Hinduism. So it's not a modern phenomenon. They were going around, telling stories, and then these were sort of imbibed in their own lore, and new stories were built. Now this is a very important painting, and very because it is one of his major narrative work. So here the story is, this is Shiva and this is Parvati. Then Parvati goes for a walk. When she goes for a walk, she sees a cow in the story that 5 bullocks were having intercourse with one cow. And then she goes further and she sees similarly Suna Kutta, meaning dog by Suna, the name Suna, which also appears the name in Upanishad. But and then there is this Shravana story where Dasharath is shooting an arrow at Shravan, who has gone with his 2 parents to pilgrimage and things like that. But what he tells us, the story that he tells is that Parvati, when she saw the cows like that, she laughed. And when she laughed, the cow said that don't scoff at me. In your next birth, you will be born as Draupadi and you will be married to 5 Pandavas. And then here Draupadi and 5 Pandavas are shown. And then there are other very archaic memories of the community. So for example, Jangarh says that this floating eye, and in that eye there is a bird, and there is another bird over here. And Jangarh says that before Mahabharata or Ramayana or any of these were composed, this bird is known as Phadki Chidiya. Phadki Chidiya was a bird that was witness to the composition of all the epics and things and all that. And these epics, the Phadki Chidiya, narrated to people in a cave. So these are like not related to Hinduism, but it gets all coming together, the tribal myths and Hindu myth that has come to them. So this comes from Pandwani story. And then he did, when I did the exhibition Other Masters, Jangarh was working there in Crafts Museum, and the same story he did in 2 panels in clay relief work. This is the only work I know of Jangarh where he has used the medium of clay relief which was traditionally done by women. So that's the only visual tradition that he had. But he very rarely used it except for that exhibition. But he could mold relief very well because that was there. Then talking about the myth of creation, I'm talking about now how Jangarh got into into narrativizing things from individuals' images of like scorpion or gods or thing. He got into narrative and he handled it. I already showed you that one where he opens windows and tells the story, not like in a comic strip manner, but and so many things converge into this. Now they have I'll wind up now. Yeah. They have a creation myth that is in which it is believed that there was a great deluge, water everywhere, and then Mahadev rubbed some dirt from his body and put life into it, and he made a crow. And that crow then was asked to, because there was deluge, there was no earth, and therefore the crow was asked by Mahadev to go and collect some earth from underworld. So he goes to underworld and takes the help of a crab. So he sits on the crab's thing and claws, and then he goes into underworld, and from here he brings the earth, and then the crow comes out and then gives the clay to Mahadev, etc. So that story, and then the Parvati story, that Ganesh story, gets combined here, that the Hindu story. And in a Parvati story, that Shiva's son was the Hindu story of Ganesh, that was made to sit outside when Parvati was taking bath, and then Shiva came in, and then he didn't let him go inside. So in anger, he chopped his head, and then he told Parvati that, oh, sorry, I didn't know it was our son. So whichever first creature you meet, you bring, I'll restore, and that's how Ganesh comes. Now, in the story of these people, it is actually the crab. And it is believed that the crab in Kali Yuga, because there are several Kali Yugas, so in one of the cycles of yugas in Kali Yuga, the Pardhans believed that they had and that Parvati met this crab, and that becomes the sorry. That becomes a creature like Ganesha. And here you can see various depictions of that story here. And I'll wind up because and then last 2 images that in Vidhan Bhavan in Bhopal, which Charles Correa had designed, Jangarh was, there was a question of doing murals, and I was consultant for that and had known Jangarh for a long time then. So these were huge murals, like 20 feet, 30 feet long, about 10 to 15 feet high. And so I told Charles that since you are building Vidhan Bhavan, or the assembly building where legislation would be done for Madhya Pradesh people, and Madhya Pradesh is very undivided. Madhya Pradesh then had very large tribal population, and therefore how about asking a tribal artist to do these murals? He liked the idea immensely, and we commissioned Jangarh to do these murals over there. Talking about interventions that Jangarh brought in even here. First of all, the space itself was a great intervention. And then, now this, I chance landed on some old negatives, and where I found that there were these two images that he did. This airplane, large airplane, and this. Now you can see that they do not belong to Jangarh's vocabulary in a way. So I found all negatives that Jangarh had given me many, many years ago, and in that I saw the details of drawings like this. And you can see that this is not Jangarh's drawing. It is an art school trained hand, which, and this whole tiger over here is also not his drawing, this kind of thing. So an assistant who was working with Jangarh to help him with pigments and all to handle such a large scale mural, he did some of the drawing. But the interesting part was that Jangarh, after that, he changed he used that basic drawing, and then he used his own personal individual style of dotting and pattern making, etc. and things. But what I find very interesting is same happened with this airplane, that the drawing behind this is a mechanical and engineering kind of drawing, that pilot's cabin over here, the wings are done more or less correctly, the windows and the perspective and things like that. So whereas his airplanes were like this, and this a new thing came. But interestingly, as I'm always talking about how interventions came, and Jangarh welcomed those and became a part of his vocabulary. And that is how I think that that Jangarh's artistic expression and vocabulary grew. And then I think these are the reasons, or these are the things which brought Jangarh into modern space. Thank you very much. Before we have this discussion with regard to the idea of modernity, idea of modernity and tribals, certain traditions and things, I wanted to give you a general view of Jangarh's work. Now, issues that come out of that, we discuss now with Annapurna.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for having us here, and especially Banti Chand and the Asia Society, and Dr. Jain, and the audience who is packed and very keen for this conversation. So that makes me very happy. Yeah. I'd like to begin. So what we've done is actually to make the discussion very focused, is to have a long conversation. Just to familiarize all of you, I have been thinking with Dr. Jain's work since I was maybe 26 or 27 years old, which is now I'm 50. So that's a long time. Yeah. So it's a great honor for me to be here and do this sort of conversation. So in that process, we've been talking about these issues for at least maybe in different forms, maybe at least 3 to 4 years in different ways. And when this show happened and the book was written and he invited me to do this, we decided to sit down and actually formalize that more informal conversation to make it cover those questions. The second half of the title, which is A Conjurer's Archive, is the first half, which Dr. Jain just presented. Yeah. Now we're going to do the art historical divides part. And here we'll begin with, I think, the first question. And while we have decided on the questions, I don't have any idea about the answers that we're going to have, because Dr. Jain has been thinking about it. And I'm really excited to hear this. So, Dr. Jain,
yes,
if we accept that modernity and modernism are not the same thing, then what sort of modernity did institutions like Bharat Bhavan practice when they organized art in categories? As you already mentioned, there were 2 categories at the Bharat Bhavan. One was for the art school trained artists, and one was for the tribal artists, the 2 spaces. What role did Jangarh play in making Bharat Bhavan's modern identity? We always think about the question from the angle that is he a modern artist? But actually, I think it's important to also see it from the other direction, that the presence of Jangarh, Bhuribai, and many other artists who are in that other gallery,
Yeah.
how did they make the modernity of an institution like Bharat Bhavan? And then the last part of that question is, how did his art and that of other Adivasis consolidate the modernism of art school artists when they were displayed in the same institution? This was not a conflict-free process. So it's an interesting discussion to have.
Yeah. At Bharat Bhavan, I noticed, and I was even a trustee once upon a time and used to go there quite right after its inauguration. I found that there was a kind of ambivalence about the issue of tribal modernity, contemporaneity. So this was like all the time loosely played around and often in contradiction. For example, say Swaminathan, and at Bharat Bhavan there was no art historian, there was no anthropologist, right from it was primarily a modernist institution with modern artists around. And Swaminathan was one who wanted, and there was a lot of resistance that Swaminathan had faced for this, that he wanted to bring tribal artists, and there were even physical fights and things that we're not going to. But what I'm
Why
trying,
not?
time. So there, for example, loosely they played on art. So what happened was that, I give an example. I quote two sentences from Swaminathan. One was that he had a dialogue with Mark Tully. I think Mark had gone to Jangarh's village, and on the way they were talking, and he met Swami also. So Mark asked him that, he asked him some questions about his issue of modern artists and tribal artists and the gallery and the museum they were developing. So Swami said, we are running an art exhibition, not an exercise in ethnography or anthropology. So he was talking about, this divide, art and, for example, a kind of contingency was not important for him. What was important for him was kind of autonomous, art is autonomous practice rather than contingent.
Art for art's sake.
Yeah. So he didn't want that. So I saw an exhibition, for example, at that time, a huge exhibition of terracotta, and there was no caption. So I asked somebody, why there are no captions? So he said, no, Swamiji said that, these must be bereft of any information about cultural background, etc., but they should be like the object should speak for itself. So now this position was very clearly coming out constantly. But at the same time, they wanted to do, Swami wanted to put modernist artist works as well as tribal artist work together. And there, I think Ashok Vajpayee, who was then, I think, he was kind of chairman or something, he said once that to give folk and tribal artists a sense of dignity, that they are as good as anybody else. There are tribal artists displayed along with Manjit Bawa, Ram Kumar and Hussain. This camaraderie Swami alone could think of, he says. So this camaraderie, what was it about, was never articulated. So just to put them together, and it was a great achievement, so why was it not defined that what was the basis of that camaraderie, that were, I feel that, as you asked me whether modernity and things, there was tremendous confusion over that, and this is what was happening over there. The second part of your question was, when this camaraderie, nothing was established, modernist artists fought bitterly with Swaminathan, Krishna Khanna and people, and they said that this art is different and this cannot be put together in the same gallery. That was Swaminathan's idea. And finally, it was decided to have two separate galleries under Rupankar Museum head. One was Gallery of Modern Art and one was Tribal Art. So this is what happened finally, because modern. Also, I think there was a big dispute at the time of Indian Triennale that one committee had selected folk and tribal artists as a part of exhibition that was free. And then I think there were big fights and finally the folk and tribal artists were removed. So this kind of confusion was, I think, going on also in Bharat Bhavan about their modernity.
Do you think that some of the artists felt that their modernism and would be compromised by the presence of people like folk and tribal artists? And
yeah, I mean, there were often disputes about this, and artists were heard saying that we have spent 7 years in art school, and you are supporting only tribal artists. And once I remember that there was the Bharat Bhavan's annual day or something like that, and there was the campfire, and then artists began to be sarcastic on Jangarh and said, "Oh, you become a great artist," and this and very. And then Jangarh got angry, and he took out his clothes and put in the fire and said, "Okay, then I'll go back to my village as I had come over here." So this was like, there was a conflict going on between the tribal artists and thing. But what I feel is that the issue of modernity that Swami should have articulated if he wanted to include, then I think he should have talked about what were the various modernist interventions that Jangarh was accepting and what was he doing with his interactions and things like that. For example, his poster color, paper, rotring pen, the material that came. Then large-scale works on Bharat Bhavan dome, for example, he did. Now, this dome, it was a circular movement. I showed that. It was very circular and widespread. It was not a space, not a rectangular canvas space. And he dealt with that space differently. When he got very large spaces to paint, or he turned towards narrative. So, I think that he was experimenting with printmaking, as I said. So when he was, and then he was imagining subjectivity and memory that he came things with. So that he gives form to the, all this I thought was entering the space of the modern for me.
another question I'd like to pose to you is another set of terms.
Yeah.
Which are being batted around for a long time now.
Yeah.
And they have a long history.
Yeah.
How do labels such as artist, tribal artist, Adivasi,
Yeah.
Jangarh Kalam, Gond painting,
Yeah.
etc., frame or position an artist like Jangarh?
First of all, we can't call him tribal artist in that he was a tribal. But, nothing of his tradition. They only had meager clay relief work along the floor and then on at the junction of the ceiling and the wall. Jangarh's work does not show anything of that in his work. So he didn't come from a tribal art tradition, and therefore, like Jivya, we still might call a tribal artist because he still used that vocabulary, but he did other kind of work. But in Jangarh's case, first of all, that was not there. So his art was not tribal in its formal language as such. His muse was molded at Bharat Bhavan when he came over there. A modern art institution, and he evolved as an individual artist and therefore an artist rather than tribal artist. So I don't see why would this tribal become necessary. He didn't come from tribal formal tradition, and he also did not I mean, he worked as artist. He worked with imaginations, subjectivities. He worked with new materials, image making, narrativizing certain things. Many things that he did were not a part of his tradition, and therefore he was kind of working in a modern space.
So when you say that, actually, to continue that line of thought, of course, as you said, they didn't have a major visual art tradition, but they did have a bardic tradition because they were singers.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to just, in conjunction with the same question, reflect on how their historic profession, in a sense, right, or role in the Gond community per se, to be the bards for those communities, to bring that into, to translate, to transform that into a visual language. How does that itself, can that itself be seen as a modern experience?
Interestingly, not a single painting of Jangarh has a reference to Gond stories. Jangarh is painted primarily from the world left behind and recreated Bharat Bhavan from his memory of mythology, shamanism, forest creatures, forest life, and then he created images out of that. So there was no connection to Gond epics as such. Right. So they were bards, but because those were stories of war and the epic scale stories of Gondwana and things like that. I don't think he did any painting from that. Then you asked about, so in the art world itself, though, I mean, he was continuously sort of snubbed in Bharat Bhavan. For example, when he became known, and a lot of his paintings were, I mean, he began to sell, he began to be shown in major platforms world over. Then, but his job was, he was appointed as an attendant. An attendant is like peon who brings tea and things like that. So when he became very known, the art school trained artists who were in Bharat Bhavan, many of them, they would sort of tell him, oh yeah, you have become a very great artist. Come on, take away these cups and plates and clear them and bring some tea for us, or things like that they would tell. Then he would go and complain to Swaminathan. Then interestingly, Swaminathan gave him a new designation. He changed, in appointment letter, he changed his designation from attendant to artist. So he was given a new appointment letter as artist. I was talking to somebody from the Dhumimal family the other day at art fair in Delhi. And the lady told me that when Swaminathan organized an exhibition of Jangarh's work, most modern artists, including Kishan Khanna and others, they fought badly with and said that we will not show in your gallery if you do this exhibition. And Swaminathan and Jangarh both were manhandled in the gallery. It was first time a modern art gallery was showing Jangarh's work. So even at Bharat Bhavan, Swaminathan wanted to put these works together as modern. But since artists disputed on that, there also now we have two separate galleries, modern art gallery and tribal art gallery. Even a big collector of Jangarh's work in Delhi, a very major collector of Jangarh's works in Delhi, once told a person in Bhopal that Jangarh was used to drinking tea with slurping sound. So he said that Jangarh is a fine artist, but please advise him not to drink tea with slurping sound. So, the kind of things he used to face, and as a person, but also in the art world, there was a whole resistance around. You talked about Jangarh Kalam. I think Jangarh Kalam, if at all, then it should confine only to Jangarh's work and not to all the artists who came afterwards, because I do not, it would be so, it would be unfair to the artists who have now branched out and doing very different kind of work from Jangarh. So I think it is wrongly being used to describe all the work of Pardhan artists in Bhopal.
Actually, I just want to add something to that last story. In 2010 and 11, as Bunty mentioned in my introduction, we did this show called Vernacular and the Contemporary.
Which one?
Vernacular and the Contemporary.
Yeah.
At that time, I'd broken my foot and I couldn't attend I think the reception or the closing ceremony for one of the two parts. And I was in Bangalore, and I get this phone call from a friend of mine who was at that reception, and they said, it's not sitting around my ear. I have a very small ear.
Mine too, it keeps falling.
It just keeps falling off. And then I have to make space for my glasses too. Thank you. Okay. So it was really interesting experience and very telling. So this is 2010. You're talking about maybe much earlier. That this person called me and said, you know what everybody's saying here? That if Devi Art Foundation is buying all this work that is priced much less, what's going to happen to us?
Yeah.
So this is a very crisis.
Yeah.
And it's a crisis for the existence of this kind of art. You know, those divides between modernism and folk and tribal art, between contemporary art and folk and tribal art. Let's go to the next question. This is something I'd really like to hear you explore further. Modernism sees itself as the arbiter of the new, and that's the premise of the modern. How do we think about Jangarh's capacity to handle the new? Because you've told us that he taught himself printmaking, color paints, the idea of making visual art itself. He's really exploring this. He was made in Bharat Bhavan. So how do we think about his capacity for handling the new, given that he entered modern art institution without any art school training?
Yeah, I think the way he handled, say, large spaces in Vidhan Bhavan, what he did with the domes, you know, it was a circular kind of movement, something that he had not ever known before. The way color sort of appealed to him, as he once said that when first time he got poster color and a brush, he dipped in, he put it a kind of sweep on the paper, and he told me that when I saw, because in their village they had the brightest color they had was yellow clay, the rest was brown and clay color. So he said that when I first time saw this, the magic of color on white paper, he said tremors went through my body. Now this, was some response to. Then the way
it's a phenomenological response, a visceral response,
Yeah, and then you can see in his work how color has, when he first time got this rotring pen, the way he used it to create this very kind of luminosity and auritic kind of things around, like halos and things like that, or the way he uses textures with that black pen and thing. Nothing of that comes from his tradition as such. And nor was there any artist who was working like that. So I think he, being in the art world, in Danto's sense, that he was in art world, and he understood, he derived a lot, or not derived, but he sort of interacted with that art world, but he worked with a language that was his own, that he created. So he was not, like, for example, he did not plunge into the world of, easy world of abstract painting or thing. He understood that that was something else. But he was sort of still dealing with the contemporary art. I mean, his interaction with that sort of helped him to do what he was doing.
I've always thought let's just take that one with the rotoring pen where he produces this aura around whatever subject he's doing, be it a scorpion or whatever, that he's actually incorporating and celebrating the new through his own technique and his own bodily labor with this sort of tool that he picks up. But that tool itself is also, in a sense, worshipped because he brings such beauty out of it.
Yeah, but worship, what happened was that his initial work was giving anthropomorphic form to his gods, which never were anthropomorphic. Legends were never illustrated. So with coming to Bharat Bhavan, he realized the possibilities of expression of a kind which I call secular, in the sense that the walls were, all wall work that was done there was sacred, So his paintings, even if they had religious subjects or gods, they were not meant for worship. So it was a shift, from one kind of space to another.
But I guess what I mean is that there's a kind of celebratory joy in that new medium that he's discovering. And that experience itself is given that aura of specialness and beauty,
sure.
right?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Right. So Jangarh did not come from, and you mentioned this in your talk, Jangarh did not come from any tradition of narrative painting, and his early work comprised largely of mono or singular image paintings. In your view, what led him to turn to narrative painting?
I think that the scope that he got with spaces that, large canvases, paper, domes, walls, these spaces sort of invited him to turn to narrative. And as I said, he had come very young to Bharat Bhavan, and he had come with the memories of these myths. And I have seen this happening. Look at Ganga Devi's work, for example. She never did narrative painting, but when paper came, or Jivya Swamashi, they all of them, they turned to narrative because they want to tell their story, sort of, and they see the scope with modern materials and things to tell their stories. That's how Jivya's, lots of his paintings are stories that he came, but they never had a tradition. So they had to invent narrative devices to cast narrative time into visual space, for example. And the way these devices, Jivya, for example, in telling, narrativizing his inherited stories, he would divide the canvas not like in a standard horizon, horizontally going like that, but he would go sort of diagonally or things like that. And to one time to the next time because narrative time, there are many, so one incident happens now, after many months or years something happens. So how do you deal with that time in narrative space? Like Jangarh opened those windows, and then the eye was floating somewhere else. So these devices were sort of developed by him as artists, and that's what many artists have done when they entered new material. So there was a kind of shift from the sacred to the profane, I would think. That, and as they went into the profane, once the barrier was broken of the sacred, and one could go into the profane, then I think desire to tell stories begins.
So would it be fair to say that sometimes a medium can produce an artist in a new way?
Yeah, for example, look at his rotring pen. Before that, his drawings were very thick line and they were just, there was nothing of the kind that you see with the new material and paper and color. That was Jangarh's major change and something that provided him scope for expression.
Did he recognize these things in your conversations with him?
What?
Did he ever comment on these sort of things? I know you've recorded, for example, what he said about the encounter with color.
Yeah.
Are there some other incidents where he talked about medium?
So like that, like rotring pen, he was so excited. And then he would explain to me that point 3 and 4 he would use for this kind of work. Point 1 he would use for another kind of thing. And he was so, and then he was saying that it was difficult for him to get rotring ink, which was very,
it's very
different
necessary.
thing. Yeah. So he tried out using local ink in Bhopal, and then it didn't work out. So he was very kind of conscious about what the materials were doing vis-a-vis his wanting to express certain things.
And the last question, I guess, before we end our conversation, and maybe the audience would also like to ask you a few questions, is, though Jangarh worked on flat surfaces such as paper...
Jangarh worked on?
Though Jangarh worked on flat surfaces such as paper, canvas, or walls, he neither flattened the pictorial space nor practiced art school realism.
Yeah.
So how was his visual language formulated?
You know, flattening of space, like, say, Pierre Mondrian, you know, like two-dimensional space, and by his work, he's not creating, he's not faking the third dimension as we would do in perspectival or realistic representation. We fake the third dimension in a way because the surface of the paper is flat. So Jangarh was doing a third thing, and that was he was neither flattening like Mondrian would do, nor he was doing like
illusionistic,
realistic work with dimensionality and thing. What he was doing was that with his language of patterning and textures, he was using it in various places that in order to give a sense of life, like I showed the lizards, for example, here and things like that. He would use that area to give a certain kind of feeling that was required, and there a certain dimensionality or things would appear, but he would not use generally so his textures and patterns that he created became a tool for giving life to the creatures or things that he was depicting, but he was not really flattening in a modernist or Mondrian sense as such, nor was he inflating the space as perspectival thing would do. So I think he was a master of these textures and things, which a language that he built, which he would then create a scorpion or a crocodile or some, where they are sort of, as I said, breathing or heaving with...
And the dots then sparkle all over the surface.
And a certain kind of dynamism would come, life. So he would impart life through his textures and patterns, which was a language that he developed. It was not inherited from somewhere, but while working. And I think it comes largely from his printmaking experience. Also his drawings are very related to printmaking. And in Bharat Bhavan Dome, for example, he used those palm impressions that comes also from there. So he created a language for himself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we have time for a few questions, I suppose, right? Anybody has any questions?
Good evening, sir.
We can't hear you. Can you just raise it a little higher to your...
I'm Kritika, and I want to know, like, you just told the stories how the artist, the so-called educated artist, bullied Jangarh. If it just vice versa the situation, like the educated artist being in the village between the tribal people, I don't think so that the tribal people will be bullying the artist. Or if we take a situation...
Did you follow?
You finish your question and then
Or if we take a situation that an artist who has taken forms or the shapes or something he has adapted from the tribal people and exhibiting his work in a gallery, the other artists, they won't be bullying that particular artist, right? So does the modern artists, like we should call them the modern artists who are bullying the uneducated people who has adapted like their predecessors' art form, like does modernity means this thing, bullying the tribal people?
Yeah, you know, I think if we really go by art historically, modernist movement or things like that, then we would remain that, okay, this is what modernity is. But basically, modernity has also a lot to do with certain, say expression of subjectivities of a kind, creating certain kind of images or use of imagination. So tribal art, for example, could have been repetitive and used for ritual purposes. But when you step out of that and you do other things, you know, then I think you do step into modern world because you're reflecting towards, you're reflecting on the perhaps social, political, personal predicament that you around, and then you reflect that in your work, including your personal subjectivity or even individuality, then I think that would, you know, because there's no such definite thing about modernity except modernist movement when it started. And if you only historically look at that and confine to that, then it's a different thing. But I think, today, I think modernity is to be defined that when you step out of a kind of repetitive tradition and you become an individual, you have your subjectivities coming, your imagination starts to, you know, play a role in what you construct and things like that. So I think these are signs of modern, yeah.
let me answer your question from a different angle. Or let me respond, not answer, respond. So the fundamental premise that your question is coming from is the bad modern artist and the poor, uneducated tribal artist. So actually, that's a very modernist way of thinking about it. So remember that quotation that Dr. Jain put at the bottom of the opening slide? Maybe it's the next slide after this, which says, you know, if he is not primitive, he's not authentic or something like that, Sally Price. Well, the fact is that tribal artists or tribal people or human beings all fight between each other also, right? So it's not like this question that you're assuming is that he was only introduced to conflict when he left the village and came to a modern art institution. And once he came there also, there was a lot of turbulence and turmoil among his own community about his being such a famous artist. Yeah. At one level, he was the person that brought a lot of people from his community into the art-making experience. At the same time, time moves and people become no longer assistants, but they become artists in their own right. Yeah. And then these issues come. But the framing of an artist like Jangarh and somebody who is an art school person in an institution like Bharat Bhavan is going to create a structural issue about who has power. And that's what Dr. Jain is really talking about when he was talking about things like what happened when, you know, artists asked him to clean up the tea and those sort of things, right? So these are issues. The gentleman over there.
What was the kind of salary that he was getting as an attendant, like you said, when he was first called and then later on as an artist, when he was given that post? And I mean, do you think that it was like taking undue advantage of what he was doing at that time?
He was earning the salary of an attendant. In those days, it would be like around 5,000, 7,000 rupees. When he went to Japan, and he created about, in a month, he created 10 to 12 paintings, and he was paid 12,000 rupees a month. And his painting at that time already, around that time, were selling up to 75,000 rupees or more, one painting. Later on, of course, as I said, that recently a painting of his has sold for 37 lakhs or more. So his salary was that time, and compared to that time also, it was a peon salary, you know, kind of.
What I meant is that wasn't he he being taken undue advantage of when he was given just that kind of salary, but the paintings were used for other purposes? That's what I meant.
Yeah, I mean, he also told once Mark Tully. Mark Tully said that, "Are you going to Bhopal to learn painting?" So he said, "No, we don't. I don't want to. I don't go there to learn painting." That time in his village, he used to do with charcoal, which was found somewhere. He used to do drawings on temple walls or something like that, but not following the clay relief tradition as such. And so he was doing drawings and things like that. So he said, "No, I don't go to Bhopal to learn art. I go there to earn money." Because he was anyway carrying mud on his head, and he was a construction worker, kind of.
Yeah, I had a couple of, it was a very interesting and a very informative lecture. And I have a couple of questions. One is, like I think part of the answer has come already. Like, other than this Bharat Bhavan, the other paintings he did, in Japan. So is there any records of which almost I think the answer is already, that was one question. The second question which I want to know.
No, I didn't follow the first question.
Other than Bharat Bhavan, like, the other works he has done, is there any record somewhere else we get? So you almost answered that, I believe. Right?
You mean collections and things?
Collections.
Oh, yeah. He's been, I think he's the most collected Indian folk or tribal artist anyway. And this Museum of Art and Photography has, I believe, more than 100, 150 paintings in their collection. There's another Delhi collector who has another 100 or more. And in Japan, the museum has quite a lot of collection. But I think he's majorly collected in France. There, I think, I believe altogether in French collection, there would be at least 200 to 300 of his works.
And is there anyone who is following the tradition, like almost now that...
Following what?
His line, inspired by his work. Anyone is doing
is there anybody
similar work?
In his footsteps?
Yeah, because what is described as gone school or falsely thing. So they, they are work, because when Bharat Vidhan Sabha Bhavan mural project came, Jangarh needed help because it was very huge project. So he called a few people from his village, and they began to work with him. And that's how the so-called gone school came about, because before that, Jangarh was the only one, because as I said, he never came from a tradition. He created his own tradition. So there, I think later on, many people learned, and now they have all gone in their own individual paths.
Dr. Jain, can I just, sorry, I have to leave. Can I just, I've been waiting for about 10 minutes to ask this, just quickly. So Dr. Jain, firstly, thank you for a wonderful lecture. But what I wanted to ask you was to just look at it from the context of how tribal artists and artists, indigenous artists are being received generally, even now, even though it's opened up. Do you think that there is a resistance from the marketplace? Is there a resistance from the marketplace? How does the market and the gallery structure, which operates in a certain way, is that, do you think, part of the reason that this hasn't really emerged as a strong enough form in a country like India, which has so much of this art, and which you have done so much to promote in a sense, but it's still really not part of being understood as part of our contemporary culture, modern art culture in that sense. And you think there is a market resistance to it? I'm just curious.
I don't think, there is a big change today than when Swaminathan did those galleries and things. I think today a large number of galleries which are generally showing modern art, they are all interested in showing, a lot of them are at least interested in showing these works, and particularly, for example, Kiran Museum. It was they who asked me to do this major retrospective of Jangarh's work. Now they are renowned to be modern art museum, Kiran Museum. They are deeply interested, and Kiran was telling me that they want to build now a major collection of not only Jangarh but Jivya Samamashi and things like that. Long ago, I think 30 years ago, Camol Gallery in Bombay had commissioned with Jivya Samamashi 30 paintings based on his legends, and extraordinary paintings were created by Jivya at that time. The Kochi Biennale, actually the exhibition that I did in Kiran Museum, it was asked for by Kochi Biennale, and they wanted to have that as central exhibition of the Biennale. And the only thing what happened was that initially they were able to offer me this much space, and I thought if I do something on Jangarh, because I had already done with other masters and things, I was not very keen. So I said if I do something, then I'll do a major retrospective. And Museum of Art and Photography has a big collection. I had access to collection. So they were very keen on it, but they said, we'll tell you if we can get a bigger space for you. And they took about 4 months. In the meanwhile, Kiran Museum offered me the entire space, so I did that. But what I'm trying to say is that even Kochi Biennale, which is a modern art biennale, they're very interested. Not last year, but the year before, the art fair in Delhi has introduced a major component of contemporary folk and tribal art, and increasingly, so I think these boundaries are thinning, and this thinning of boundaries is not only because of market and a thing, but the practice itself is also crossing over, and I think that also is an issue. Like in Jangarh's case, or even Jivya's case, I showed one painting. I think unless you want to stick to modernist avant-garde movement and call only that modern, otherwise what would be the definition of modern, in the sense that what are the elements that make things modern? And I think those are heavily present in this work: thought, imagination, subjectivity, experimentation, crossing over to something else, responding to memory. Lot of those things were the basic elements of modernist artworks. Unless we say that only either you use the established modernist language, which is another issue. But this is now, I think, thinning.
So I just want to say something to your question. You've talked about market, and he's also talked about the artist. The Devi Art Foundation's Vernacular and the Contemporary, I think, was their most fully, widely attended exhibition of all the exhibitions they did in that location in Gurgaon, where people even weren't going that much to Gurgaon. And in fact, I think the catalog is gone. So there is a demand, in a sense, from the audience's side for art that they can engage with, relate to, that's also quite different. It challenges the eye. It makes you think. Like when you look at Jangarh's work, your eye has to do your eye and your mind has to do a lot of activity, like brain work, to decipher things, to understand textures. Yeah. It's not like a simple art, right? It's not just patterns.
So conceptualization, image formation, expression of subjectivity, going into narrativizing things which didn't exist, experiments as he did in printing. If all this doesn't make things modern, then I think we would have to confine to avant-garde modernism and yeah. So linear modernism.
So Meenakshi and then Deepika.
for a fantastic presentation and a lovely conversation. Some of the points that I wanted to ask were already answered, so forgive me for focusing on a small detail now. I was fascinated with, I mean, some of them were real revelations about how the uncoiling of the snake is to do with time, but also, which one knows about, but also I didn't know about them looking at scorpions also being associated with time. I'm just also fascinated because it's things that we typically tend to associate with creatures connected with poison. And in my head, somehow now this new connection of time with poison coiled somewhere is fascinating. Can you tell us a little more about that? And also you talked about how he loved snakes a lot.
How he?
Snakes, he loved snakes a lot. So can you tell us a little more about all these, please?
Sure. For example, you know, this measure of time. I was talking about it, I'm very fond of that scorpion painting. He has done many of these. And I was talking to Jangarh, and he said, he explained, and that spirit you can see in the painting. You know, he's lying there in that slumber of eons, that feeling, how he manages to bring it in. And he said that, as we used to move around in the forest and thing, and if we move a small rock like that, and suddenly there would be a scorpion there. And the scorpion wouldn't suddenly be startled, but would remain where it is embedded in the earth. And therefore this embedded in time kind of thing, that it would be there for eons, you know, kind of he was talking about. So this measure of time, of that cosmic kind of time, related to him, but that feeling does come out, unless I'm biased that what he told me. But I think when you look at it, it does bring you into a very primeval kind of atmosphere.
Deepika?
Yeah, just a couple of comments and questions. One was to respond to Tasneem's thing about why the market doesn't respond the way it responds to prices in, say, a modern painting. I think it's a combination of many things. One, when you say the audiences are ready for it, I think they're getting ready now. It's very much a perception of how much we think it's worth. And
how much we think is?
How much we think that art is worth.
And
worth.
Yeah.
Worth. And, you know, modern art is always...
Sorry, because, you know, this was something, a lot of echoes, so...
She's a good translator.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of modern art has had its time of 50 years for that value to be attached. So something like even a Hussein would sell for, say, 500 in the 50s or 60s, but as audiences have realized that gains value with time, maybe that is waiting to happen with folk art. Now with folk art, the other perception for Indians is we've seen a lot, say, in the marketplace. So this, again, it has, I would always say, a mind switch that you have to change that within folk arts, there are masters like Jangarh. And where that distinction comes from is where you start understanding his formal practice. Like somebody, when, again, you talk about what is modern in him. For me, just the formal language. To give somebody a new space like a dome and to see how he uses scale on that dome with that big swan in that image you show. Someone who takes two lizards and, again, with scale, plays it up so high. And one word that you use, dynamism. I mean, I think I've never seen such movement in still life that he's done. And for me, these are all really modern ideas coming from someone who's completely untrained, and it's fantastic. And I think, therefore, to acknowledge him as a master in what he did is something that is not given credence as yet. And I think these things, when you talk about museums now showing their work, that's the museum end. But you have to think about how Swaminathan gave a space for somebody like Jangarh to come. Are we giving spaces to more folk artists to do this kind of experimentation and this freedom, provide the materials that they can't otherwise access? I think Kochi Biennale is a place that is allowing for this to come in, but you need a lot of other spaces, institutions to allow this to happen.
Pack that a little bit. Continuing again with what Tasneem said, but also addressing. I think there are many different ways in which an art form or an artist can be recognized. So one way is, of course, that you're doing your work. No. So I'm building on what you're saying. I'm building on what you're saying. So I think that one of the most beautiful things about Jangarh Singh Shyam's experience of art making is that it's an instance of where somebody's artistry is the first thing that caught somebody's attention, right? Swaminathan was captured by his facility with drawing, and that's what drove his entry into a larger art world. So he became a migrant for that reason, as opposed to anything else. For example, somebody pumping in a lot of money and saying, I'm going to put you on the auction house or whatever. But the other thing that's really interesting is that his art was never a folk art, right? Nobody in his folk assumes community at some level, but this art was never for his own community. It was for, in a sense, a kind of community that had developed through Bharat Bhavan, a sort of visual culture that was developing in Bharat Bhavan.
Even for that very reason, he was modern in the
For
sense
that very reason, he was
didn't
modern.
come from
Right.
a collective tradition.
And then the third thing I want to say is, this isn't just related to Jangarh, but it's also related to Madhvi Parekh, who is the other artist that faces this dilemma. Because here you have this major woman artist who never went to art school, right? And then there's a narrative that's built up about her from the first time she shows to now, when she's at the Kochi Biennale. That here is this woman that's miraculously been discovered. But actually, if you follow the threads of how she tells her story and how Jangarh's story developed, they're constantly either being trained or training themselves. So for example, Manu Parekh, who's a wonderful teacher, trained her. And how did he train her? Through Paul Clay's notebooks and Paul Clay's pedagogy techniques. Jangarh, I think, was a person from, please correct me if I'm wrong, but whatever I've read, I've never met him, that he was had a lot of facility with materials and image making. I think he liked physical work, and art making for him was a very physical activity.
But he also, by being at Bharat Bhavan,
yes.
One important role that he played was not that the other modernists began to imitate him, not that, but he brought awareness that there are other modernities. And that pedagogy, so to say, to use your word, that in Bharat Bhavan, this awareness came that there are other modernities. Till then, it was thought that art school, these, and they all were hounding him. This awareness which came to Bharat Bhavan spread, and then now look at KNMA wanting, Kochi Biennale wanting, so this is also something that people like Jangarh brought about a kind of, so it did shape a differently attitude and therefore practice perhaps.
But also, Bharat Bhavan itself was a pedagogical institution. It wasn't just a gallery, right? You know this, but it had printmaking workshops, Daroz set up, ceramic department, so many things were there. He, I'm sure, attended lots of theater because so much important major theatrical works were premiered there. Now, when we say what exactly is the role of pedagogy in, or training, or encounter with art in the formation of anyone's artistic self, right? Subjectivity. And in that sense, I think you can see, at least from the printmaking and other things, that he was in Australia, and he was really thinking about what Australian artists were doing. And there's a beautiful work that's in the book, if you step out, which is a combination of Bhuribai,
Jangarh Singh Shyam, and two star artists of Australia. They worked together on a 6 meter long canvas and worked together. Jangarh was also exposed to that. But Australian artists clearly say that his way of patterning and dotting is different from ours. That means he was not copying those, he was using it differently, the language that he constituted. But interestingly, that Jangarh, because you mentioned theatre, Bharat Bhavan had a theatre wing, but very few people know that Jangarh used to be, a lot of time he used to spend with theatre actors and things, and he designed posters for some of the most famous theatrical performances of like Dharamveer Bharati's Neeli Jheel Ka something, and all, the National School of Drama, and then Prithvi Theatre. He was all the time around, and all theatre people, directors, actors were good friends. So his exposure, he was interested in stepping into that phase. He has fantastic poster. One poster I have published in my book.
Saryu, you had a question?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. In Bhulabai Desai institution in the 50s, there was a young boy who was in that atmosphere of that creativity. There was theatre, there was music, there was dance, there were a number of artists working, and he imbibed so much and intuitively started sculpting. And his works were superb. He started with wood carving and then went on further, and then, I'm sorry, I didn't follow his career, I don't know what happened. But sometimes I think it's that creative atmosphere that gives you the impulse. And some of these people are so intuitively creative that when they are surrounded by this, they imbibe and they create and they express. That's the way in which some of these artists are created. I mean, can you imagine that a person like Jangarh creates a tradition? There was no tradition.
Yeah.
There was nothing which he could draw on. But seeing so much around him, he created a tradition which is now being followed by so many people. And even Jivya, took an existing tradition, but that was a sort of a ritual tradition which he transformed into something else altogether. So personally, what I'm trying to say is that it's really the atmosphere around you, your own creativity, that results in something like this. I don't think you need teaching or you need those things. Something like that intuitively comes through.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're done for the evening.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for all of you for staying and for hosting us.
Thank you. Thank you.